The clock had already struck midnight when Princess Anne crossed the threshold into Queen Camilla's private apartments at Windsor. No announcement, no polite knock. She carried a thick, 6-page dossier and set it down on the table with a kind of finality that leaves no room for discussion. In that moment she informed the Queen that control of the Windsor estate was no longer hers. The truly startling detail is not the confrontation itself. It is that the King had already signed the order. Hours earlier he had placed temporary, absolute authority over every internal operation at Windsor into his sister's hands. Then he simply returned to his study and waited while and carried out the transfer. This was not a family quarrel. This was a documented transfer of power executed with legal precision. Before we examine how the sequence unfolded and why the timeline exposes the fragility of the entire modernization project, a quick note. If this kind of close examination of royal power dynamics interests you, subscribe to the channel. It allows us to continue producing this work. Now back to the events. What makes a situation remarkable is the person at its center. For decades, Princess Anne has been the member of the family who rarely generates headlines. She does not grant emotional interviews. She does not build personal brands. She simply appears at hundreds of engagements every year and, as it turns out, also spends her private hours conducting detailed examinations of property contracts. That is where the entire episode begins. Word reached her of experimental changes in the way leases at Windsor were being handled. She did not send a formal letter of concern or wait for the next scheduled committee. She went to the records rooms at first light, thermos of tea in hand, and began comparing 19th century land grants with the contracts currently in force. That is classic Anne. While others whispered in corridors, she sat in a windowless archive in a plain dark jumper and assembled a legal case from the original documents. What she uncovered sits at the heart of the contradiction. The Queen's office, Camilla's administrative team, had been advancing a quiet reclassification of certain historic portions of the estate. They were shifting them from protected heritage status into the category of commercial assets. On the surface, it sounds like administrative housekeeping. In practice, the difference is decisive. A heritage asset carries layers of statutory protection, traditional committee oversight, and preservation standards designed to prevent casual conversion into revenue-generating space. Once the same property is labeled commercial, those layers loosen. Lease terms can be rewritten more freely. Outside contractors can be introduced. Decisions can be taken by a much smaller group. And found evidence that a carefully selected circle operating under the current administration had been making precisely those decisions, bypassing the established oversight structures entirely. If that account is accurate, the public defense of modernization collapses at a critical point. Updating systems is not the same as removing scrutiny. Processes can be improved while checks and balances remain intact. Wharton discovered verbal understandings treated as binding contracts, alterations to maintenance agreements that effectively neutralize long-standing committees, and reclassifications executed without proper authorization suggest the priority was not efficiency but the concentration of decision-making power. Confident reforms leave a paper trail. They are presented to the relevant bodies, consensus is built, and the record is clear. Informal handshake arrangements that would not survive external examination do not meet that standard. The pressure point that brought the matter into sharp focus was the Royal Lodge. Public discussion has centered on Prince Andrew, the cost of upkeep, and whether he should remain in residence. Anne examined the same situation and reached a different conclusion. She identified unauthorized concessions on lease terms, reduced rents, and flexible arrangements offered by the Queen's office in an attempt to resolve a public relations difficulty through private negotiation that completely avoided the traditional oversight committees. From Camilla's perspective, the approach may have appeared pragmatic. Contain the problem quietly, keep family difficulties out of the newspapers, and demonstrate to the King that a complicated issue could be managed efficiently. From Anne's perspective, the danger was structural. Once Crown property rights become private bargaining chips, the precedent is set. Every subsequent arrangement becomes open to challenge. Public confidence in the management of royal assets rests not on convenient outcomes but on the legitimacy of the process itself, and therefore assembled her dossier, 60 pages of annotated evidence. She did not offer opinions. She placed copies of original land grants beside the altered contracts. She traced how incremental changes to maintenance agreements had been used to circumvent committees that had operated for generations. She documented the reclassification of heritage assets without the required authorization. Then she delivered the file by hand to the Queen's private secretary and stated that a formal written response was expected within 48 hours. That is not an invitation to discussion. It is a deadline accompanied by an expectation of compliance. At that point, the story shifts from disagreement to the visible collapse of administrative authority. Staff later described the Queen's team entering a state of acute alarm after reading only the opening sections of the dossier. The alarm was not caused by personal gossip or private embarrassment. It was caused by the exposure of structural weaknesses in the entire strategy. Attempts to draft a rebuttal met an immediate obstacle. The facts could not be disputed. The original charters said one thing, the newer contract said another, and no intermediate paper trail explained the transition. That is not a difference of philosophy between tradition and progress. It is an administrative failure recognizable to anyone who has worked in compliance or institutional governance. The avowability of a crisis is what continues to stand out. Had the changes been routed through the proper channels from the outset, however slow, however resistant those channels might have been, the Queen's team would have possessed a defensible record. They could have pointed the process followed, consensus reached, and formal approval obtained. Instead, they attempted to move faster than the system permitted. When and began examining the documentation, the structure unraveled. That sequence is inconsistent with the claim of ordinary modernization. Ordinary modernization produces records. Ordinary modernization does not treat verbal understandings as contracts. Ordinary modernization does not react with panic when documentation is requested. The deeper interest lies in the clash of institutional philosophies. Princess is not simply a traditionalist opposed to change for its own sake. She holds that the monarchy's authority derives from continuity, from the fact that the institution has survived because it does not reinvent itself with every new occupant of the throne. In her view, the Windsor estate is not a portfolio of assets to be optimized for short-term return. It is a trust belonging to the institution itself, not to whichever individual currently holds the title. Treating it as a commercial enterprise may produce immediate financial gains, yet it erodes a very continuity that justifies its protection. Camilla's team operates on a different set of assumptions. Empty cottages represent unused capacity. Event spaces and revised leases represent potential revenue. Their language is that of market valuation and strategic asset management. That perspective is not inherently unreasonable if the long-term financial position of the monarchy is a genuine concern. The difficulty arises when modernization is pursued by methods that disable the safeguard designed to prevent short-term decisions from damaging long-term assets. The king's position throughout remains deliberately opaque. He is a person who signed the order transferring temporary absolute authority over Windsor operations to his sister. That is not a minor administrative adjustment. It is a direct repudiation of the administrative approach associated with his wife, made after and presented her findings. He examined the evidence and concluded that the risks identified were serious enough to require complete reversal of the modernization program. Then he withdrew to his study and maintained silence. No public statement. No attempt at mediation. Some of the longest-serving courtiers interpret the silence as strategic. They believe the king allowed him to perform the necessary but politically costly work of clearing the administrative structure so that he himself would not have to absorb the personal consequences. By remaining silent, he preserves the appearance of distance and becomes a visible enforcer, the figure who secured the administrative wing, removed Camilla's staff, and terminated the external contracts. The king remains a figure who simply took a difficult decision in the interest of institutional stability. Whether that reading is accurate or whether he simply could see no other route that would not damage his marriage remains an open question. What followed the midnight meeting is in some ways more revealing than the meeting itself. By early morning, the administrative wing had been sealed. The security personnel who entered were not drawn from the regular Windsor detail. They were experienced officers, many of whom had served during the late Queen's reign, accompanied by individuals whose primary loyalty was to the traditional institutional structure rather than to the current administration. Office protocols were immediately returned to earlier forms. Digital booking systems were deactivated and replaced by traditional ledger entries. Files were removed from cloud storage and transferred to secure physical locations. Rooms were examined for listening devices and tracking equipment. Members of the Queen's staff were given until the close of the business day to collect personal belongings under supervision and were forbidden from removing files, laptops, or internal notes. This was not a managed transition. It was a seizure of operational control. The visual transformation was deliberate and unmistakable. The Queen's team had furnished the wing with contemporary art and open-plan desks intended to encourage collaborative working. Within 48 hours, the art had been removed and the furniture replaced with heavy traditional mahogany desks. The aesthetic of the modernization period was systematically erased. The message was physical as well as administrative. The experiment had ended. One does not merely alter policy, one alters the environment so that no one entering the space can imagine the previous approach is still operative. Camilla herself now occupies an ambiguous position. She retains the title of queen and continues to perform public duties, yet her capacity to manage her own diary, direct staff, or initiate new projects has been suspended. Access to her requires clearance through a security filter. The phrase circulating among staff is administrative house arrest, and the description is not exaggerated. She remains physically within the castle, yet she has been disconnected from the operational machinery of her office. Trusted aides have been removed. Contractors she introduced have been dismissed. Projects she authorized are under review by a committee chaired by Princess N. The isolation is functional rather than ceremonial. The detail that gives the episode its historical resonance is a single handwritten note on the final page of N's dossier. It was an order signed by the king granting his sister temporary absolute authority over all internal operations at Windsor, and did not arrive at the midnight meeting merely with evidence and argument. She arrived with a document that had already altered the legal position. The conversation was not a negotiation. It was a formal notification. The decision had been taken. The Queen was being informed of the immediate limitation of her administrative authority, and conducted the exchange without visible emotion. She did not engage in abstract debate about modernization. She confined the discussion to the documentary record. She stated that the king had examined the risks and had chosen to place the stability of the institution above his wife's preferred direction. That is a severe communication. Not merely that a power contest has been lost, but that a husband has reviewed a wife's work and judged it sufficiently hazardous to require intervention. The personal weight of that moment is difficult to overstate. The terms were unambiguous. Direct control of Windsor estate management by Camilla would cease at once. All projects associated with her office will be placed under formal review. Access to the central archive for her private staff was withdrawn, and the closing condition carried the clearest consequence. Any further attempt to circumvent the newly constituted council would result in full public release of the dossier's contents, and was stating that resistance would place the public record of how protected crown assets had been handled into open view. That is not a warning issued for dramatic effect. It is a structural constraint that renders opposition practically impossible. Camilla cannot contest a change without risking the public narrative she has spent years constructing. The wider implications for the internal balance of the monarchy are substantial. Princess has for decades been the reliable, low-profile constant. She has now demonstrated that when she elects to act, she is capable of neutralizing an entire administrative program within a matter of weeks. She constructed a case, presented it to the king, obtained his signature, and completed the transfer of control before anyone outside the immediate circle was aware of the sequence. That level of operational discipline is rare even in corporate environments. The king's continued silence raises questions that are unlikely to be answered soon. Is he privately distressed by the necessity of choosing between sister and wife? Or is he relieved that another figure has resolved a difficulty he felt unable to confront directly? Those courtiers who regard the episode as a demonstration of institutional endurance may be correct. By allowing him to absorb the political cost of dismantling the modernization program, the king preserves his capacity to function as a unifying public figure. That calculation, however, succeeds only if the marriage itself survives the collateral damage. At present, the reports describe a household in which the two principals coexist rather than collaborate. They no longer discuss the estate. They no longer discuss the longer future of the monarchy. They inhabit a residence in which one has been stripped of operational authority, and the other signed the instrument that made the stripping possible. Staff who observe the king now speak of a mixture of respect and quiet concern. He spends extended periods looking out across the formal lawns. His appearances at public ceremonies have become less frequent. He remains a figure of immense wealth and historical weight, yet he cannot alter even minor arrangements within his own residence without the matter passing through his sister's committee. That is a peculiar form of constraint. He has secured the institutional position for the next generation, yet the personal autonomy he might once have expected within his own home has been replaced by a system that subjects even his own directives to verification against traditional charters before they can be enacted. The unresolved question is whether the monarchy emerges stronger from this internal correction. On one side, Anne's intervention interrupted a pattern of decisions that were embedding genuine structural vulnerabilities, informal leases, verbal understandings treated as contracts, and the reclassification of heritage assets. Had those practices continued, eventual public exposure would almost certainly be more damaging than anything that has occurred so far. From that perspective, she identified a risk and neutralized it before it matured into a crisis. On the other side, the method of resolution has created a fracture whose healing is far from certain. Camilla remains queen, yet she is a queen who was outmaneuvered and deprived of administrative authority by her sister-in-law with her husband's formal approval. That is not an episode that simply fades. The public performance of family unity on which the monarchy depends is now under visible strain. Every subsequent public appearance by Camilla carries the knowledge that, behind the ceremonial surface, operational control has shifted. Power has returned to the traditionalist side of the institution, and the transfer left no ambiguity about the outcome. The Windsor estate itself is once again under the direction of the individual who knows its documentary history more thoroughly than anyone else. Digital systems have been withdrawn. Contemporary art is in storage. External contractors have been dismissed. The castle has been restored, in Anne's terms, to its sovereign purpose, a space governed by continuity and inherited practice rather than by market metrics and efficiency targets. Whether that restoration strengthens the institution or merely renders it more resistant to necessary adaptation will shape the next phase of the family's public story. What is no longer in doubt is that the period of polite internal disagreement has ended. Princess Anne did not merely contest a set of policies. She dismantled an administrative apparatus and substituted her own personnel. She employed the institution's own rules to constrain those who had sought to stretch them, and she executed the process with precision that ensured that by the time anyone outside the inner circle grasped what had occurred, the change was already complete. The midnight meeting was not the climax of the conflict. It was a formal confirmation of a victory already secured. The substantive work had been completed in the archives, in the construction of the dossier, and in the private conversation in which the king examined the evidence and signed his name. The contest is therefore larger than leases and maintenance schedules. It concerns whether the institution can adapt without discarding the foundations that give it lasting value. At present, the figure who regards those foundations as non-negotiable holds every operational key.